Hey everybody, this is a video on a quarter panel assembly with the inner structure on a 2013 Nissan Pathfinder. I have two examples here. One is all the OEM parts that are pieced together where they overlap at certain section joints, and then I also have we'll take this apart to show how it's constructed. I also have a LKQ used quarter panel that was as suggested by the insurance carrier. This is the condition it comes to us. All the trim is still on, glass, moldings, electrical, brackets, you name it. Most of the time, of course, we see things on the panel itself that's not only fully assembled, but usually see things that can show extent of some damages that are still on this vehicle. Rust, areas where it's been crushed, or you could see where it's been impacted before. Like I said, this part comes off of a salvaged vehicle from a junkyard that is most likely in an accident, and we have no idea where this part will come from in the country. So what we're going to do is I am going to have a time lapse of taking apart this used quarter panel, taking all the trim off and removing the suggested quarter panel that they wanted the outer wheel well attached with the outer panel. There is an adhesive that runs across this wheel well so it could be watertight. We're going to explain how it is not possible to remove it from the outer wheel well to inner wheel well area and keep the quarter panel attached still, and we'll go through definitions and how that is not possible, and then we'll go through the OEM parts about how everything can be pieced together shortly. So the whole point of cutting out the glass is there are pinch weld and spot welds along where the glass actually goes that attaches it to the inner structure. You see the spot welds all through there. So to remove those, you have to have access to them. All right, so we're at a point where we're going to start cutting. I've cut away as much as the seam sealer as I can. I'll have to grind this down so it looks like here, so I can identify where all the spot welds are. And what we're going to do is attempt to separate this outer panel with the outer wheel well still attached, and see if it's salvageable. I know one thing we're going to run into that is it's impossible to get to the pinch weld seam on the inside where that red above where the red line is because that is the outer and inner wheel well that is welded together, and there's a lot of intermediate pieces that separate it. So what we're going to have to do to have access is I am going to remove all the sheet metal as best I can right below this red line, and to try to keep the outer wheel well as intact as I can to the outer quarter panel. And then we'll discuss why it would be nearly impossible to attach that afterwards. I want to go over some of the tools I know we're going to be needing for what we're about to do. This is a strike punch. What it does is when you have access to a hole or a weld, you could center it and you could strike it, and it's going to leave a nice little imprint. So when I use my 1/8 inch drill bit, what I need to use the 1/8 inch drill bit is to create a pilot hole deep enough where it'll only penetrate the outer steel and the inner, not all the way through to the inner structure. But it's mostly a pilot bolt, because when you use these 5/16 rotor bit, which is literally a fraction of an inch smaller than the 8 mils that these size of the welds are, because if they're listed in the OEM guidelines, you have to match as original as OE as possible, and all these measure at 8 mils. So the rule of thumb is, if it says it specifically, match it. If it doesn't, replicate OEM stock, and that is what 8 mils are, and that's what the size of this bit is. Now the hard part about these bits is it's very hard to gauge how far you can go into the panel without destructing the backside of the panel, and maybe rendering it unrepairable, because you're essentially taking away from the steel that you need to weld to, and you would have a weak bond when you do weld everything back together if you are doing a MIG weld. The preferred choice of welding, instead of MIG wire field welding, is spot welding, which is what the stock OEMs use to replicate or to do this kind of welding, which is the best and most efficient kind. So I'm going to make a time-lapse video of what it's going to do to take apart the rest of this, and to start removing all the welds. And also we're going to use a Sawzall to take our initial cut to separate the outer skin and the wheel well all in one. Now that we have the majority of the inner structure out of the way, we can remove the rest of this trim, and we can really access now. You can see here's the outer part of the quarter panel, and there's still some inner structure parts in the way: rear body panel, tail light reinforcement pillar. Also the inner wheel well is still in here and intact. And then here's the inner structure that was only approved by State Farm. One thing we're going to run into, I know there's an inner pillar support right there that is part welded to the bottom of the outer wheel well, and we'll address that once we get to that point. I'm going to detrim this the rest of the way, and then have another time lapse of removing all the inner structure welds. So I just removed the section that is actually part of the rear body panel. Rear body panel will go across this whole way. This essentially is going to have, once the welds are removed, you're going to have to set back enough to be able to remove the welds all the way out of there. So you can keep the inner structure. But in this case, I think this inner structure is going to have to be changed because of the overlap of other panels. But we'll get there later. But something to note: this is the rear body panel, part of the rear body panel, that you're going to have to either fold out of the way or remove enough welds to be able to get this out of the way to be able to access these welds. Two bolts is what attaches the inner wheel well to the outer wheel well, and they are next to impossible to get unless you have the floor out or the rear body panel out, there's no way you could squeeze your arm through here and get to that. It's almost impossible. Another problem by trying to use a outer quarter skin with the outer wheel well still attached and taking apart and off the inner wheel well is that there are inner braces for, in this case, I think the seat belt actually ties to, or part of the seat. And this bracket, which would normally go up and over on the back side of the wheel well, actually we could see it on this original part here, or the LKQ part. This bracket that goes all the way down to the floor, this would have to be completely removed to be able to access the welds on the back side of this panel. So there's you either do that, or we're going to use the roto zips right now to show the labor process of that. This is where we're going to be starting to get into some overlapping issues. You can see where file belt is the obvious way to go because it's very non-intrusive to the surface. It makes it very flush to the surface. But where the roto zips, you can see going, they actually cut in to the structure of it really deep. And that is what actually takes away from the structural integrity of the steel. But what we're running into an issue now is, I know the insurance carrier wanted and actually was paying for a new upper inner structure, which is this piece right here. Well, what we're going to run into is the taillight support structure. This is the inner piece, and there's an outer piece that actually goes under the quarter panel, but you can see this structure panel goes under this piece, but it's sandwiched between the other inner structure piece. So it goes 1 panel, 2, and then 3. So the problem is this panel has to be completely removed to be able to fully remove the welds off this panel to replace off the inner structure. The problem is, for reverse engineering, you can't not start from the inside out when you weld this, because this whole inner structure goes up into the roof rail. And to be able to fully access this, you actually have to do it from the underside. Again, another reason showing that you cannot have an outer skin attached to the outer wheel well, which is on top, in this case, on top of this inner structure. You're going to have to pretty much drill out this entire weld to separate the outer wheel well from the inner structure. And then the problem, of course, with that is you cannot weld it from the inside, because that panel I just replaced or took out in the original vehicle, it's all flat steel. So you'll have a hole in there that you cannot fill, because it's essentially, this outer wheel well is sandwiched between this inner structure and the inner wheel well that was sitting right in here. All right, this is a good time to stop to talk about the inner workings. I'm about to remove this outer wheel well from the inner window structure, upper structure of this LKQ Quarter, and removing the welds across here. Where we're going to run into a problem is there is a pillar support bracket that runs all the way up and around. There's a bracket that welds here, and even though the welds are noticeable here because there was an outside bracket attached to this, they're almost impossible to figure out where they are right there. And I'm going to show you the construction of this thing, of how it's supposed to be gone through. So what I have here is all brand new OEM Nissan parts. And how this is meant to go together is, of course, like I said, reverse order. So I'm going to carefully try to flip this over to see if it won't come apart, because the only thing holding all this together is with clips. So we have the outer panel itself. If we remove the outer panel, this might be best to show the other way around. I'm afraid this will come apart. Okay, the order this should go is the outer wheel well. You can see it's practically going to lift right off. Because there's no other inner structure panels holding it. But that is also the downside on it, is because this is a very last piece that overlaps inner structure. As you can see, it actually sits on the top of this inner panel. So when that is removed, you're going to see the trouble we're having. This inner bracket right here is that one part I was telling you about on the LKQ Quarter panel. Is nearly impossible to track all those welds where they are. As you can see, I have an example here, but there's a gap here missing. Looks like there's probably one or two welds here, one probably on each side of these little tabs, and two over here. Now, this is part of that inner structure that the insurance company wanted to change. The one part I do not have is that inner tail light reinforcement, what's it called, D-pillar structure piece. That would normally go right in here on top of this panel here on this corner. Once that's removed, then this inner structure can be removed. At that point, you can see this bracket is actually part of the whole C-pillar that goes all the way up to the roof rail and up to the quarter panel top roof rail. See, it's a pretty large piece. So once that is removed, you can see that the outer structural pillar assembly is then removed. Then from there, the actual tail light support bracket, or the tail light outer panel. I have a nut and bolt helping secure that in place. That is removed, and then also the filler neck for the gas door also has its own piece that is not only panel bonded but welded into place, that is attached to the quarter panel itself, and part of the outer wheel well that gets welded and bonded to. So as you can see, if you reverse engineer this, it is really not meant to have the quarter panel, which is the last panel really the first panel to address. And the very first panel that we removed out of this whole structure was the outer wheel well, just because of the way everything overlaps. All right, so now that the outer skin is still attached to the outer wheel well on the underside, all here. Now we have to remove the outer skin spot welds that is part of the roof rail, that inner fender or inner structure piece, which is this piece. Pretty much sets just like that under the outer skin. One thing that I know right off the bat that I know we're going to run into is when I'm drilling out all these spout welds, even though that roto zip is right at or a fraction of an inch under 8 mils, we're going to have too large of an opening that is going to be outside of the tolerance of what the stock OEM welds are. And the reason why that's important, whether you have too much of a weld or too little of a weld, what you're doing is, if when you change that size of a weld, you're really changing the way this sheet metal is supposed to crush, tear, rip in an engineered specific manner to absorb as much G load or to protect the occupants in the vehicle. So we'll test the size of these holes after we go through it all. So here we have the left rear quarter panel that has some areas where there is some foam on the panel, and the outer wheel well is still intact and attached to the outer skin. The problems we have, of course, with that is somehow the inner structure here has to sleeve into there. Also, the inner brace that all runs here and connects to the bottom of the well, really to the outer wheel well. As you can see, it's nearly impossible to find those welds through because it's completely smooth. Getting to these welds that are welded through these tabs, said there's no indication on the bottom side of that wheel well where to see it. As you can see, to put this together, not only does the top of the quarter panel have to lip across the whole roof rail, it also has to go into here, and at the same time, once it goes into there, the inner or outer wheel well has to go on the underside of this panel. Now this is where the trouble lies. The new panel that's going to be put in, there's no way to weld all three pieces together, or to be able to get access to this area to not only do weld cleanup, but to also do any kind of corrosion protection and treat the protective coating that's on this to have corrosion protection. So that is why LKQ Quarter just isn't not only a quality repair, and why it goes against what OEM spec says to actually fit this to get back onto the panel, to lip this whole corner, and to somehow slide this inner piece all in one shot is impossible. And like I said, you cannot get to this backside, let's say for this side of the welds, with this panel in the way. It's just impossible. That's why when we went through taking it apart each individual piece, you're able to access all of that and weld all of it individually, so you can have proper corrosion protection and make sure all the inner structure is where it needs to be. The last thing we're going to do is, I know we were talking about measuring. Let's see here. So, for example, all these holes, as you see, it's zeroed out the micrometer. When we put this inside the drilled out hole, we're greater than 8 mils. By the time we weld, and the weld actually welds and will overlap this hole, it's going to be greater than 8.5 mils. So that is also why this isn't a viable repair, because the tool to remove the spot weld is greater than the allowed size that the spot weld should be. So there you go. Here's the inner structure of the LKQ Quarter. Of course, has the exact same structure as the client's vehicle, 2013 Pathfinder. Again, here is that C-pillar support that has to be changed, because obviously this piece is overlapping the inner quarter panel structure. But also this is where that D-pillar structure, again, it overlaps, as you can see, this whole inner structure itself. Again, this inner structure is sandwiched in between this inner structure piece and this inner structure piece. Again, you can see that from there. Here's the inner. Here is the insurance paid inner structure. And then here is the D-pillar, also support post. Also a good thing to point out is the inner structure, inner quarter panel piece that the insurance company did want to pay for, which is this piece right here. As like I told you, it goes along this area. And as you can see, it goes on the other side of that pillar and it follows the contour of this glass. The problem that we're going to run into, why again this is not a viable repair or quality repair procedure, is because with this out of the way, there's no inner support structure, which is this piece. This piece would actually have to go in first. I'll try to get that in there. And this actually has a weld to the actual body of the vehicle. So this goes in there just like that. And then this goes in like so. So again, these are individual pieces, so you're able to slip it in here. But because this panel needs to be changed, which it rightly should, because it's a sacrificial piece, just to be able to get this piece out. To be able to get that out, again, you're going to have to change out this piece. And when you change out this piece and this piece, you're going to need to change also that whole inner structure on the back D pillar. Hello, so what we're going to do is we're going to disassemble this quarter panel assembly and inner structure all in one, how it's pieced together like it should be and like it's provided from the manufacturer. What we're going to do is we're going to flip this over and from inside out show you how this should be assembled. Start with the outer quarter skin. That's going to come off. Outer quarter skin is removed. And the inner structure lays as it follows. So we have the outer wheel well, which we will see again. The support bracket welds directly to the outer wheel well. And to access not only the back panel, this complete panel has to be removed. And then again, to access the inner structure, the tail light pocket or the gutter is going to have to be removed. And then the D-pillar support structure is going to have to be removed. And then at that point, because this inner structure isn't impeded by this in the way, then this can be removed. Again, this inner structure window frame opening overlaps the outer wheel well. So when that is removed, then finally this can be changed. which is the outer wheel well. That's it.